Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources and unlock the most important knowledge inside. Today, we're diving into a substantial technical guide, feels like it's over 80 pages, focused on integrating SAP Joule, SAP's AI co-pilot, with various SAP solutions. Our mission, to really cut through the complexity, pull out the absolute core steps, the necessary groundwork, and the crucial insights you need to connect Joule into your existing SAP landscape.
Yeah.
Think of this as your essential shortcut, basically, to understanding the technical blueprint without getting totally lost in every single detail. Let's unpack this document.
Sounds good. So this guide, it starts by giving you a bit of a lay of the land. It recognizes that, well, you might be starting this journey from different points in your SAP Business Technology Platform or BTP setup. The simplest scenario, and frankly the luckiest one, is if you already log into your SAP product, maybe like the BTP cockpit itself, and you just see the Joule icon there, ready to go.
Okay.
If that's you, you're essentially onboarded at a fundamental level and can, start exploring right away.
Nice when it's easy.
Yeah, but probably a much more common starting point is likely having BTP already in place. You have accounts, entitlements, users set up, but Joule isn't yet active or connected. Here, the guide really zeroes in on a key automated tool, the Joule Booster.
Okay.
But, and this is critical, the source strongly emphasizes that before you even think about running that booster, you need to have already configured the trust relationship between your BTP setup and your central identity authentication tenant, and ensured that key user attributes are properly configured. Those are like total non-negotiables before you hit the booster button.
Right, got to lay the groundwork first.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the starting point where you maybe don't have BTP established yet at all. In this case, you need to sort of pump the brakes on the Joule guide for a moment and first follow the standard BTP setup procedures, getting your global account, sub-accounts, entitlements, initial admin tasks sorted.
Right.
Before you can even really think about running the Joule onboarding steps.
Okay, so it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all path. You kind of meet the guide where your current landscape is. That makes perfect sense. Now, you mentioned prerequisites and the booster. Let's dive into that core step-by-step onboarding. Once you've sorted out your starting point, what are the fundamental technical building blocks the guide says you must put in place to get Joule itself ready?
Exactly. The guide lays out this multi-step process, and it's focused on getting the foundational services integrated there on BTP. It all starts with, well, as you just touched on, the essential prerequisites.
And what are those absolute must-haves before you even, crack open the technical configuration sections?
Okay, the guide is very clear on this. You absolutely need a license for an SAP product that Joule actually supports for integration.
Makes sense.
We're talking products like SAP SuccessFactors or perhaps S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition, and it needs to be running in a compatible data center location. Beyond that, and this is crucial because Joule relies on it for knowing who you are.
Right, identity.
That SAP product must already be integrated with identity authentication for user login. That link has to be there. Then, on the BTP side, you need an enterprise global account, and you need the necessary entitlements for SAP Cloud Identity Services. That's actually both identity authentication and identity provisioning, the IPS service.
Okay, both parts.
As well as entitlements for SAP BuildWork Zone, specifically the Standard Edition. So with those foundational requirements met, the guide then walks you through a series of specific technical configurations. These happen within BTP and your identity services. First up is configuring trust to the identity authentication tenant. Think of your identity authentication tenant as like your central login desk for users. This step involves setting up a secure relationship in your BTP sub-account so it trusts that login desk as the authoritative source for user identities. A key detail the guide stresses here is making sure the domain name of your identity authentication tenant is the same one used for single sign-on setup with your core SAP system. That match is important.
Okay. For SSO to work smoothly.
Exactly. And this trust relationship must use OpenID Connect or OIDC. The guide explicitly states that using SAML Trust directly for Joule in the same sub-account isn't supported for this specific connection.
Good to know. OIDC it is.
Building on that trust, the next essential step is configuring user attributes. You need to actually go into the administration console for your identity authentication tenant.
Right.
And confirm that specific user details things like email address, parts of their name, maybe any group memberships, and critically, their global user ID are present and correctly mapped from wherever your main identity directory lives.
So Joule knows who it's talking to.
Precisely. It's not just about knowing that you've logged in, but who you are. Once trust and basic attributes are sorted, you move to running the Joule Booster. This is a pretty powerful automated wizard right in the BTP cockpit. It's designed to streamline a lot of the follow-on configuration.
The magic button?
Sort of. You point it at the specific BTP sub-account, you select which SAP solutions you intend to integrate. This is where the Joule icon should then appear later. You choose the capabilities you want to provision and specify which identity authentication system and underlying SAP systems you want to use. Now, running this booster, it sets up a logical grouping of these systems within BTP's System Landscape service, which the guide calls a Joule formation.
A formation. Interesting term.
Yeah. And a specific constraint the guide points out is that right now you can't manually add or remove systems from this formation using the standard System Landscape UI.
Oh.
You actually have to raise a support ticket for that. Also, importantly, you currently cannot mix and match S4 on Cloud Public Edition and Private Edition systems within the same formation.
Okay. Limitations to be aware of there.
Definitely. Finally, you need to configure trusted domains. This involves setting up lists of allowed host names or domains in both your Identity Authentication Console and your BTP sub-account.
Why is that needed?
Well, it allows the different components like Joule, WorkZone, and your integrated SAP products to securely interact and load content from each other across different domains. It's pretty essential for the user experience, preventing browser security issues.
Wow, that's quite the foundational sequence. Getting identity configured correctly, making sure the right attributes are flowing, and then leveraging that automated booster tool. It really does sound like the absolute core of getting Joule itself stood up on BTP.
Yeah.
Are there any major limitations or constraints that the guide highlights that someone absolutely needs to be aware of before starting all this?
Yes, definitely. The guide lists several crucial constraints that are really good to know up front. First, right now, Joule conversations are only supported in English.
Okay, English only for now.
And you can connect one Joule subscription to multiple types of SAP products, say SuccessFactors and S4HANA, but you can only integrate with one specific tenant of a given product type within that single Joule formation.
So, one SuccessFactors tenant, one S4 system per formation.
Exactly. The guide also emphasizes that your Joule subscription and the corresponding SAP BuildWorkZone instance or subscription must reside in the same BTP sub-account. That's especially important if you had to manually set up the WorkZone navigation service destination for some reason.
Keep things together in one sub-account. Got it.
We already touched on the OIDC requirement for Identity Authentication Trust, not SAML. And for the technically minded, there's a rate limit mentioned, 3,000 requests per minute per tenant for Joule interactions.
3,000 per minute. Okay, that's quite specific. These limitations are really valuable insights. Knowing the boundaries up front helps immensely with planning, doesn't it?
It really does.
And for completeness, the guide even covers the cleanup, how to unsubscribe and delete your Joule subscription. It clearly states that this action permanently removes all your tenant data and chat history associated with that subscription.
Yep. Important to know the exit strategy, too.
Okay, so once the core Joule service is onboarded on BTP, the real fun begins. Connecting it to the SAP products where you actually want the AI assistant to do things for users.
Yeah.
The guide dedicates specific sections to integrating with different solutions, showing it's not just a single connection point, is it?
Exactly. It's not just one connection. The
Right.
guide covers a range of common SAP systems, including SAP BuildWorkZone itself, both Foundation and Standard editions, SAP Start, SAP SuccessFactors, SAP S4HANA Cloud Private Edition, SAP S4HANA Cloud Public Edition, and it even mentions integration with products like SAP Product Lifecycle Management and SAP Integrated Business Planning for Supply Chain, though it often points you to specific SAP notes for the really fine details on those last two.
Right.
Across many of these integrations, particularly for scenarios where Joule needs to help users navigate to applications within the connected system, like saying, show me my timesheet or something.
The navigation use cases.
There's a really strong reliance on SAP BuildWorkZone and its navigation service. This usually means you need to expose content, essentially, telling the system, here are the apps users can see from the source SAP product. And then you configure SAP BuildWorkZone to consume and understand that exposed content.
Okay, so WorkZone is often the bridge for apps. Let's unpack a couple of the integrations detailed in the source. How about connecting Joule to SAP SuccessFactors? What are the key steps there?
Sure. For SuccessFactors, the guide outlines a process that starts by registering the SuccessFactors system in your BTP Global Accounts system landscape, standard procedure. Then you run the Joule Booster again, but this time specifically selecting SuccessFactors as one of the systems you want to integrate.
Okay.
You also need to ensure that an SAP Build Workzone instance exists in the same sub-account. You'll configure Workzone to consume content from SuccessFactors, usually via a REST API connection. But a crucial piece for SuccessFactors integration, highlighted in the guide, is configuring the Identity Provisioning Service, or IPS.
IPS again.
Yeah.
Seems important.
It's vital here. The IPS setup for SuccessFactors is what gets user information and, importantly, their roles and group memberships from SuccessFactors over to SAP Build Workzone.
The Workzone knows what they can access.
Exactly. This ensures that when a user interacts with Joule and Joule needs to potentially launch a SuccessFactors app via Workzone, Workzone knows what that user is actually allowed to access based on their SuccessFactors roles. The guide provides specific transformation configurations within IPS to map these user and role details correctly. And you need to run IPS jobs, basically, sync operations regularly to keep users and roles updated. The guide recommends a scheduled run at least daily.
Makes sense. Roles change.
Right. Finally, administrators need to log into the SuccessFactors Admin Center itself to actually enable Joule for users and grant specific, granular role-based permissions to the people who should have access to the Copilot functionality within SuccessFactors.
So configuration in BTP, IPS, Workzone, and within SuccessFactors itself. Quite a few moving parts. That IPS step sounds like the glue holding the user experience together, making sure permissions flow correctly.
It really is foundational for that cross-system access.
Now, connecting to something like S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition, that's different because it's typically not fully in the cloud, right? It might be on-prem or in a private cloud. How does the guide describe bridging that gap?
Yeah, integrating with S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition definitely introduces more infrastructure components into the picture. The guide focuses heavily on bringing SAP Cloud Connector into play.
The Cloud Connector.
Think of Cloud Connector as like a secure bridge or tunnel that connects your internal network or your private cloud infrastructure to SAP BTP. You absolutely need to establish trust between your BTP subaccount and the S/4HANA system through this Cloud Connector. A key technical step detailed is exposing very specific paths from your S/4HANA system through the Cloud Connector using HTTPS. These aren't just any paths. They're the ones that allow cloud services like Workzone and ultimately Joule to access things like Fiori application metadata.
Like the app index and stuff?
Exactly. The guide lists paths like SAP KREP, SAP Q2 Appindex, SAP Q2 CD and 3, and various OData service paths. Now, separate from these HTTPS paths for application content, the Identity Provisioning Service often needs its own path and protocol mapped through the Cloud Connector to read user and role data from the S/4HANA backend. That's typically using the RFC protocol, not HTTPS.
Okay, different paths for different purposes through the same tunnel.
Correct. You then need to explicitly expose the relevant SAP Fiori Launchpad content from the S/4HANA system itself. This often involves selecting specific business roles whose apps you want exposed, or maybe exposing all roles that contain Launchpad tiles and apps. This exposed content is then consumed within SAP Build Workzone. How? By configuring destinations in BTP, basically, these are addresses that tell Workzone how to reach the S/4HANA system through the Cloud Connector tunnel.
Right, pointing Workzone to the on-prem system via the connector.
And the guide specifies setting up both design time destinations, used when you're configuring Workzone, and runtime destinations, used when a user actually clicks to launch an app. It's critical to note the guide's direction here. Typically use basic authentication for the design time one, but principal propagation for the runtime destination. That's key to achieve single sign-on for the end user so they don't have to log in again.
Important distinction for SSO.
Very. And just like with SuccessFactors, IPS configuration is absolutely central here too. You set up the S/4HANA system as a source system in IPS to provision users and roles to SAP Build Workzone. The guide even provides detailed JSON transformations for the user and group entities, outlining how to map the S/4HANA backend roles and user attributes into a format Workzone understands.
Wow, that's quite the technical deep dive into securing connections and mapping identities across that private-to-cloud boundary. The guide giving specific path examples and even transformation code snippets that really highlights the detailed technical work involved there.
It's definitely involved.
What about S/4HANA Cloud Public Edition? Is that integration simpler since it's fully cloud native? Or does it have its own complexities?
Integration with S/4HANA Cloud Public Edition is also detailed, but yeah, it has its own cloud-specific nuances. It actually starts with a step unique to the public cloud version.
Oh, what's that?
You need to set up the connection between the S/4HANA system and the large language model service that Joule uses. This is typically done using the Intelligent Scenario Management app within S/4HANA Cloud itself. You have to verify that a specific scenario, something like GPT-35T completion, is published and ready to go.
Interesting. A direct LLM connection set up within S4 Public.
Yes. Then, similar in concept to Private Edition, you need to expose SAP Fiori Launchpad content. In the public cloud, this is often done using a specific communication scenario, SAP 0647. Administrators usually handle this by going into the Maintain Business Rules app in S/4HANA Cloud and checking an expose to SAP BTP flag on the relevant business rules.
So role-by-role exposure.
Often, yes. You also need to register the SAP S/4HANA Cloud Public Edition system in the BTP Global Accounts System landscape. This involves generating a registration token in BTP and then using that token in the S/4HANA system's Maintain BTP extension app to kind of link the two systems together.
Establishing that system-to-system trust.
Exactly. And once again, SAP Build Work Zone and IPS are central components. The guide details configuring IPS with S/4HANA Cloud Public Edition as the source system, typically using communication arrangement SAP 0193 for connectivity and SAP Build Work Zone as the target. You're provisioning users and roles, and again, the source provides specific transformations needed to map the data correctly between the systems. Finally, there's a step involving maintaining a custom content security policy, or CSP, in S/4HANA Cloud. This is needed to allow the Joule plugin script to load securely as a cross-origin resource within the S/4HANA environment, basically telling the browser it's okay to load that script.
So even though it's all cloud, there's still specific system-level configurations, explicit content exposures via communication scenarios, and detailed identity provisioning steps needed. It really highlights that cloud-to-cloud isn't always just, plugging things in. There's a lot of configuration to manage access and data flow correctly.
Absolutely true.
The guide also noted constraints specific to the public edition, like still being English only, not processing sensitive data within certain components, and browser requirements like needing support for iframes and third-party cookies.
Yes, those functional and browser constraints are important too.
And as you mentioned earlier, it just gives pointers to SAP notes for the nitty-gritty details on integrating with things like PLM and IBP.
Right, directs you to more specialized documentation for those.
Now, the guide also covers an interesting optional capability called document grounding. What exactly is that, and why might someone want to set it up? Sounds intriguing.
It is pretty interesting. This is a really powerful feature, potentially, that lets you enhance Joule's responses by giving it access to specific company knowledge.
How does that work?
Document grounding allows Joule to essentially use information from documents that you upload to provide more accurate and contextual answers based on your internal information, rather than just relying on its generic training data.
So it can answer questions based on our own docs.
Exactly. The guide specifies the current scope for this, though. Right now, it's designed to work with Microsoft SharePoint as the data repository.
Okay, SharePoint only for now.
Yes. And it supports file types like HTML, common image formats like JPEG, PNG, TIFF, and also Word and PDF documents. Though a limitation mentioned is that tables within documents aren't supported for grounding yet.
Good to know. Any limit on documents?
Yes, there's a current limit mentioned of 2,000 documents for this capability per tenant.
2,000 docs. Okay. How do you set it up? Is it complex?
Well, it's an additional set of steps after you've completed the basic Joule integration with your SAP solution. You need specific entitlements on BTP, something called the AI unit SKU and associated AI units, which are basically consumption credits. You then need to configure user authentication specifically for the grounding service itself, prepare your SharePoint environment for integration, configure access from BTP to SharePoint, and finally set up the process to ingest the content from SharePoint into the grounding service.
Sounds like quite a few technical steps involving services and security.
It does get quite detailed in the guide, yeah. It involves creating service instances and bindings for both the document grounding service and your cloud identity services in BTP, exchanging certificates for trust between BTP and SharePoint, and obtaining necessary authentication tokens. But the guide includes a very, very important caution about this feature.
Ooh. What's the big warning?
The document grounding capability, as it stands today, cannot automatically detect if documents contain personal or sensitive data that might be subject to data protection regulations like GDPR.
Uh-oh. That sounds risky.
It requires careful consideration, and the guide warns that any ingested documents are made available to all Joule business users within that specific tenant. There's no fine-grained access control based on the document content itself currently.
Wow, okay, so everyone with Joule access could potentially see info from any ingested doc.
That's the implication stated. Therefore, the guide strongly discourages exposing highly confidential or sensitive documents through this capability. It also notes that currently, Joule's responses from document grounding don't automatically consider context like the user's specific location or their permissions within the source systems or relating to the documents themselves.
That's a really critical insight about data sensitivity and access control for document grounding. It seriously underscores that while it's a powerful feature for adding context, it requires significant planning and understanding of its limitations and implications before enabling it, especially regarding internal document policies and data privacy.
Absolutely. It's not something to switch on lightly without thinking through the content you're making available. So if we step back and maybe look at the guide as a whole again, several key technical takeaways and constraints kind of jump out, summarizing things.
Yeah, let's recap the big ones.
Okay. Joule conversations are currently English only. That's a clear one. While a single Joule subscription can connect to various SAP product types, it's limited to integrating with only one specific tenant of any given product type within a single formation. You can't have two SuccessFactors tenants in one Joule setup, for example.
Right, 110 per product type per formation.
The architecture dictates that the Joule subscription and its key dependency on SAP Build Work Zone should reside in the same BTP subaccount, particularly if any manual setup was involved with WorkZone.
Keep them together.
For identity, OIDC trust with identity authentication is the requirement. SAML isn't the direct path here, and across many of these integrations, especially those leveraging WorkZone for navigation and app launching, there's that fundamental reliance on the Identity Provisioning Service, IPS, to synchronize users and their roles. This often involves defining specific transformation rules in IPS.
IPS is definitely a recurring theme.
It is. Then there are specific integration methods and constraints depending on whether you're connecting a public cloud system, like S/4HANA Cloud Public Edition, which involves unique steps like connecting to the LLM service within S4 itself, or a private system like S/4HANA Cloud Private Edition, which heavily relies on SAP Cloud Connector for that secure tunneling and exposing specific backend paths.
Different patterns for public versus private.
Exactly. And finally, that optional document grounding feature, while potentially powerful for adding context, has those specific limitations we just discussed. Data sources currently SharePoint, supported file formats, the document count limit, and, most importantly, requiring very careful consideration regarding data sensitivity and the broad user access to ingested content.
It's really clear from this guide that enabling SAP Joule isn't just a single checkbox you tick. It's definitely a multi-component integration project. It requires careful, detailed attention to identity management flows, specific BTP configurations, and really understanding the nuances of connecting these different types of SAP systems.
That sums it up well.
The guide provides the detailed how, absolutely. But understanding the underlying architecture, Joule running on BTP, depending on identity authentication for who you are, Build Work Zone often acting as the experience layer, and IPS shuffling user permissions around that seems key to successfully navigating all these technical steps.
Agreed. Understanding that bigger picture is crucial.
And there you have it, our deep dive into the technical blueprint for integrating SAP Joule with your SAP landscape. We've navigated the different starting points, walked through the essential onboarding configurations on BTP, explored the specific steps for connecting major systems like SuccessFactors and S/4HANA, and even touched on the optional document grounding capability and its critical caveats. It's clearly a detailed process, but the guide does lay out the steps needed.
Yes, and looking at the sheer number of identity and experience services involved here, identity authentication, identity provisioning, build work zone, it really highlights how central the identity layer and the user experience layer are becoming in enabling these new capabilities, like AI copilots across complex enterprise systems. They're the glue.
Absolutely, they really are becoming fundamental, which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to consider based on this material. Given the really intricate configuration required for identity for roles, for specific system connections, just to enable an AI assistant like Joule to function effectively across different SAP systems, how fundamentally does the architecture of enterprise software and its middleware need to evolve to make integrating future AI capabilities simpler, more secure, and maybe more inherently flexible without this level of quite bespoke technical setup for each and every connection?
That's a great question to ponder. How do we make this easier next time?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you valuable insights and perhaps sparked some new questions or ideas. We'll be back soon with another stack of sources to unpack.